There's a message a lot of millennials heard growing up, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes so often it started to feel like common sense. Trust the process, go to school, work hard, follow the rules, get the degree, build the resume, save money, stay informed, participate. The system works if you do your part. And for a while, many millennials tried. They took the classes, took the internships, took the loans, built the resumes, voted, applied, complied, and waited. They did not all reject the script immediately. A lot of them followed it very carefully, and then, slowly, the systems those choices depended on began to look less reliable than advertised. The degree did not guarantee stability. The job did not guarantee security. The market did not guarantee affordability. The news did not guarantee clarity. The public conversation did not guarantee action. And after enough of that, trust starts to feel different, less like wisdom, more like risk. Millennials have developed a reputation for distrusting institutions, government, corporations, universities, banks, media, organized religion, traditional career paths, even the idea of retirement. From the outside, the explanation feels simple. They are cynical. They are too online. They are allergic to authority. They think every system is broken and every official explanation is suspicious. And there is some truth to that. Distrust can become reflexive. Cynicism can become lazy. Suspicion can become its own identity, where nothing is ever believed and every answer is assumed to be manipulation. But like most simple explanations, it only captures part of what is happening, because millennial distrust did not appear out of nowhere. It developed through repeated exposure to the gap between institutional promises and lived experience. Force 1. Information collapse. Millennials grew up during the collapse of a shared information environment. There was a time, not perfect and not innocent, when information still felt more centralized. A few major networks, newspapers, and authorities had an outsized role in shaping what counted as public knowledge. Again, not neutral, not always trustworthy, but legible. Millennials watched that system fragment in real time. Cable news divided audiences into separate realities. Blogs challenged legacy media. Social platforms turned everyone into a publisher, and algorithms learned how to feed people whatever kept them reacting. Influencers blurred expertise in entertainment. Sponsored content made advertising look like authenticity, and suddenly every claim arrived with a shadow behind it. Who is saying this? Who paid for it? What is being left out? Why am I seeing this now? Who benefits if I believe it? That kind of questioning can be useful. It is part of media literacy, but when it becomes the default setting for everything, it changes how trust works. Millennials did not just inherit institutions. They inherited institutions being questioned, exposed, defended, mocked, debunked, and rebranded in real time. Every scandal became content. Every correction became evidence for someone's theory. Every official statement arrived into an environment already prepared to doubt it. And after a while, the problem was not just misinformation. It was exhaustion. Because when every source has an angle, every fact requires verification. And when every fact requires verification, trust becomes work. Force 2. Public institutions felt unresponsive. The second force is not silence. It is almost the opposite. Millennials have watched major problems be named over and over again: student debt, housing affordability, healthcare costs, climate change, wage stagnation, burnout, political dysfunction. The problems were acknowledged, reports were published, hearings were held, campaigns were launched, statements were issued, and panels were convened. Everyone agreed that something needed to be done. And then, for many people, the lived conditions did not change enough. This creates a very specific kind of distrust. Not, they do not know. They know. And somehow, this is still happening. That distinction matters, because ignorance is one kind of failure. Recognition without resolution is another. When an institution cannot name a problem, people feel unseen. But when an institution names the problem repeatedly and still fails to solve it, people start to feel managed. They start to wonder whether the language is a substitute for action, whether awareness has become a way to delay repair, whether the public performance of concern is being mistaken for the work of change. And millennials have seen a lot of this. They have seen crises become permanent background noise. They have seen emergencies become normal. They have seen problems move from shocking to familiar to almost boring. And when institutions repeatedly describe conditions that people are still living through, credibility drains away, not all at once, slowly. Every time the statement sounds right and the outcome stays the same. Force 3. Promises that became conditional. Millennials were raised on a set of institutional promises. Education would create opportunity. Hard work would lead to advancement. Saving would create security. Home ownership would build wealth. Participation would make the system respond. These promises were not always false. That is part of what makes the disappointment complicated. Education does matter. Work does matter. Saving does matter. Participation does matter. The problem is that the promises became conditional in ways that were not clearly explained. A degree could help, but it might also come with debt that follows you for decades. A job could provide income, but not necessarily stability. Saving could help, but not if rent, healthcare, and basic costs rose faster than wages. Home ownership could build wealth, but only if you could reach the entry point before it moved again. And participation could matter, but the outcomes often felt distant from ordinary people's lives. So millennials were not simply rejecting the old advice. They were noticing that the old advice now came with disclaimers. Go to college, but be careful what you study. Work hard, but do not expect loyalty. Save money, but understand that the math may still not work. Trust institutions, but also read the fine print. That changes the emotional meaning of responsibility. Because when people do what they were told and the promised result does not arrive, they do not just lose faith in the outcome, they lose faith in the people who kept presenting the path as reliable. Force 4. Institutional language stopped matching experience. A lot of distrust comes from the gap between what institutions say and what people experience. Companies call employees family, then lay them off. Universities talk about access, then leave graduates carrying debt for half their adult lives. Politicians talk about working families while working families feel squeezed from every direction. Platforms talk about connection while users feel more anxious, distracted, and fragmented. Brands talk about values, and consumers wonder whether the values are sincere or just well targeted. The distrust is not only about failure, it is about the polished language around the failure. Millennials became very fluent in this gap. They learned to hear when a company says community but means customer retention, when a workplace says flexibility but means availability, when a politician says reform but means messaging, when a platform says engagement but means dependence, when an institution says we hear you but doesn't change what people are actually living through. And once people learn to hear that gap, it is hard to unhear it. Even sincere language starts to sound strategic. Even real improvements are met with suspicion. Even good people working inside flawed systems can struggle to be believed. That is one of the costs of institutional distrust. It does not only punish the institutions that earned it, it also makes repair harder for the people trying to do better. Force 5. Trust became smaller and more conditional. The important thing is that trust did not disappear. It changed scale. When large institutions feel unreliable, people often shift trust downward. They trust the specific doctor more than the healthcare system, the specific teacher more than the education system, the specific journalist more than the media industry, the specific coworker more than the company, a local group more than a national organization. This is not the absence of trust. It is trust with conditions. Trust that is earned in smaller units. Trust that depends on consistency, transparency, and direct experience. Trust that does not automatically transfer from the institution to everyone inside it. And that makes sense, because millennials learned that institutions can contain good people and still produce bad outcomes. A good professor cannot fix the cost of college. A good manager cannot guarantee corporate loyalty. A good doctor cannot make the healthcare system affordable. A good journalist cannot repair the entire information ecosystem. So trust becomes more careful, more specific, more provisional. It is not, I trust the system. It is, I trust this person in this context based on what they have shown me. And that is a very different kind of trust. Less stable, maybe, less efficient, but also less naive. And this is where the deeper pattern comes into focus. Millennials did not simply lose trust because they wanted to reject everything. They became careful with trust because trust had become expensive. They learned that institutions can say the right thing and still fail to act. They learned that official language can be polished while the underlying system stays broken. They learned that expertise matters, but authority alone is not enough. They learned that naming a problem is not the same thing as solving it. And after enough examples, distrust becomes pattern recognition, sometimes too sharp, sometimes exhausting, sometimes unfair, but not random, because the distrust is not only ideological, it is experiential. It comes from watching promises fail slowly publicly, and often with very good branding. And this is the part that matters. Institutional trust is not optional for a functioning society. A society cannot run entirely on private suspicion, individual research, personal workarounds, and everyone verifying everything alone. That is exhausting. It is inefficient. And eventually, it becomes impossible. People need institutions that work. They need systems they can rely on without becoming full time investigators of every claim, every contract, every policy, every promise. But trust cannot be demanded through nostalgia. It cannot be scolded back into existence. It cannot be rebuilt by telling a generation that their skepticism is the problem. Trust has to be earned through evidence, competence, honesty, accountability, repair, follow through, not just better messaging, better outcomes. So when millennials distrust institutions, it is not always because they are cynical by nature. Often it is because they learn to compare the promise against the outcome. They listened to what systems said and then watched what those systems did. And once a generation is trained to notice the gap between institutional language and lived reality, trust does not vanish. It changes shape. It becomes slower, more conditional, and more difficult to earn. But maybe that is not the breakdown. Maybe that is the record of what happened. A generation was told to follow the rules, and then spent adulthood watching the rules change, the costs rise, the explanations multiply, and the results lag behind. So they stopped treating trust as automatic. They started treating it as something institutions have to prove, not once, repeatedly. And maybe that is inconvenient, but it is not irrational. It is what happens when belief keeps being requested before repair has been delivered.